At 0247 local time in the Gulf of Oman, a Flight I destroyer holds a slow 8-knot circle, 96 missile cells sealed under her decks. 32 forward, 64 aft. The crew has been waiting on one order for 11 hours. It just arrived. Put a railway bridge into a river in northern Iran, 990 miles from where the ship is floating. One of the last overland links carrying freight between Iran and Central Asia. The order names 4 missiles for one bridge span. 4 is not a rounding error. 4 is the output of a calculation somebody ran weeks before this ship ever reached station. By the end of tonight, that number will make a kind of sense that has nothing to do with how many warheads it takes to drop a bridge. But the moment the first hatch opens, the ship trades her anonymity for a lit flare on a black sea, and the Iranian coast is watching. Down in the Combat Information Center, the watch team starts the only clock that matters now. 108 minutes to impact. One thing before this begins. The date, the target, and what was left standing afterward are documented. The engagement in between is a reconstruction built from the systems Iran actually fields along that corridor, and from the physics that governs them, where a number comes from Tehran rather than from anyone who can be checked. I will say so. Hatch 27 bangs open on the forward deck. The first Tomahawk climbs straight up out of its cell on a column of solid rocket exhaust that turns the whole ship orange for 2 seconds. 8 seconds later, a second hatch snaps back and another round rips past the mast. The third and fourth tear out behind them. On the bridge, the officer of the deck calls the last round clear. Then the destroyer runs. 4 booster plumes have just drawn a flaming arrow to her position, visible for 40 miles on a clear night. Iran's coastal anti-ship batteries need nothing but a datum and a bearing to answer that. Flank speed 30+ knots. Wake boiling white behind her. The ship is gone from the datum before anyone ashore can turn a launch flash into a firing solution. The strike is on its own now. Now look at the forward deck, at what just threw them off the ship. That is the Mark 41 vertical launching system. A bank of armored cells built flush into the deck, each one holding a single round sealed in its own canister. When the fire order comes, the cell hatch snaps open and the booster lights inside the cell. The round rides its own exhaust straight up and out. No rail, no crane, no need to turn the ship to point at anything. Think of it as a magazine where every bullet brings its own barrel. 12 seconds off the deck, the first missile's booster burns out and falls away. A wing swings out of a slot in the fuselage. 4 tail fins flick open. Something in its back spins up to a whine. The missile pitches over, levels off about 100 feet above the water, and drives north. 3 more do the same behind it. The solid rocket had exactly one job: throw the round clear of the ship and point it at a heading. Now the whine you just heard earns its keep. A Williams F415 turbofan buried in the missile's back takes over. The engine weighs less than a large dog. The airframe stops being a rocket and becomes a very small, very single-minded aircraft. Cruise speed around 550 miles an hour. Subsonic on purpose. Range on the Block V, better than 1,000 miles. It goes up like a bottle rocket and settles down like an airliner. And 100 feet over open water, at night, it is invisible to almost every radar on the Iranian coast. Almost every radar, the one on the ridge above Jask, does not work the way you are thinking. On a ridge above the coast, a screen that has spent 6 quiet hours reading nothing begins to change. 4 smudges harden into contacts. Low, slow for jets, far too fast for boats. Driving north in a loose line, the operator has not put a single watt of energy on them. He does not need to. He passes the tracks up the line. A position box starts moving north through Iran's air defense network, racing the missiles it describes. The antenna field on that ridge has no rotating dish and no transmitter mast. Just vertical whips and a flat panel. Iran calls it Alim, and it is a passive radar. Passive means exactly what it sounds like. Alim never transmits anything. It listens to the FM and television broadcasts that already fill Iranian airspace every hour of every day, and it compares two copies of the same signal, one arriving straight from the broadcast tower, one that bounced off something moving overhead. The difference between those two copies tells the computer where that something is. Think of it as reading a boat's wake instead of hunting for the boat. Tehran says Alam reaches out between 250 and 300 kilometers and picks up slow, low-flying targets with relative ease. That is Tehran's number, not anyone else's. It only needs a fraction of it tonight, because Alim cannot be jammed by going after its transmitter. It does not have one, and it cannot be killed by an anti-radiation missile, because there is no beam to ride home. The overnight radio host in Jask has no idea he is part of an air defense network. But Alim cannot aim anything. All it hands over is a box a couple of miles wide and a heading. Somebody else has to build the shot. At 0311, a flat panel on a transporter inland snaps from cold to active in under a second. The beam lands on the bearing Alim handed it. 4 low contacts resolve. A 2-stage missile punches out of its canister beside the array and climbs. That array is the phased array radar of a Khordad 15-on battery. The whole system rides on wheels, and the array steers its beam electronically instead of swinging a dish, which is how it landed on Alim's bearing without moving a bolt. Iran credits it with finding fighters and cruise missiles out to about 150 kilometers and tracking them at 120. Against stealth shapes 85 and 45. As with everything Iran publishes about its own hardware, treat the exact figures as advertising rather than measurement. The round it just fired is a Sayad-3. It is not climbing towards some fixed ceiling. It flies a constantly recalculated intercept, its computer updating the collision point dozens of times a second, the way a shortstop throws to the bag instead of at the runner. That battery can steer 6 of these at once. Tonight it needs 4. The catch is that tonight's collision point sits just above the ground, the hardest geometry a surface-to-air missile ever faces. Earth and sea splash radar energy back off everything skimming close to them, and a Mach 3 warhead chasing a target at 100 feet can lose it in the glitter. 3 of the 4 Tomahawks are still over water. The 4th just crossed the beach, and a coastal ridge stands directly in front of it. Look at the small radar altimeter under the missile's nose as the shoreline passes beneath it. That sensor has flown it flat and level the entire way in, bouncing a beam off the water and holding a fixed height above the return. The instant the beach passes underneath, that reference disappears. The missile switches to a stored terrain map, climbing over ridges, settling into valleys, holding roughly 150 feet above whatever the ground is doing. That handoff is the most exposed moment of the entire flight. For a few seconds, the missile has to come up over the ridge before it can drop down the far side. It is a man crawling under a fence line, safe on both sides, in plain sight for the 2 seconds he is on top of it. That climb puts the 4th missile inside the Khordad's clean tracking window for 11 seconds. 11 is plenty. The Sayad-3 arrives over the crest at better than Mach 3. Its warhead opens the Tomahawk into a spray of burning debris that rains down the far slope. On the battery, the track winks out. The crew sends the intercept up the chain. First score to the coast. 1 down, 3 flying. The Khordad crew swings its beam after the survivors and finds valley mouths. The terrain has already swallowed them, but Iran does not only shoot from the ground. At 0326, an alert crew at Bandar Abbas gets a scramble order, and the Alim track file picks up a second customer. The jet breaks ground 5 minutes later and turns north. In the pilot's headset, the ground controller reads it flat, 3 contacts. Bearing 350 on the deck. The aircraft is an F-14 Tomcat. Iran took delivery of 79 of them in the 1970s and is now the only country on Earth still flying the type. The radar behind that big nose radome is older than the pilot flying it, the An Og 9, a pulse Doppler set Iran received with its Tomcats before the revolution, kept alive since by machining its own spare parts. What made it famous is exactly what it is doing right now. Looking down. Most radars of its era went blind against the ground. Everything under the beam came back as one enormous smear of returns. The AUG-9 picks a mover out of that smear by the tiny frequency shift its motion stamps on the echo. It was the first Western fighter radar built specifically to find low-flying cruise missiles against clutter, and it holds fighter-sized targets past 300 kilometers. Something as small as a Tomahawk shrinks that to a fraction of it. Iran's original Phoenix stock is long gone. So the missiles under this jet are Fakor 90s, Iran's own rebuild of the AIM-54, with a production line opened in 2018. Tehran claims 150 kilometers. Some Iranian sources claim double that. Nobody outside Iran has confirmed either figure. So a 1970s American radar is now hunting a 1980s American missile design over Iran, carrying a reverse-engineered American missile to do it. It is the most awkward family reunion in the history of military aviation. The pilot pushes the throttles up, and the tail chase is on. Then, the lead Tomahawk banks with the terrain, ducks into a canyon, and the track dissolves into the mountainside. He regains it 2 valleys later, further away than when he lost it. A stern chase is the worst arithmetic in aviation. The Tomcat cruises perhaps 70 miles an hour faster than the thing it is chasing. At that closure, every mile it claws back costs about 50 seconds, and a Tomahawk can vanish into a valley in 15. So why not simply firewall the throttles? Because Afterburner drinks fuel roughly 4 times as fast, and Bandar Abbas is already a very long way behind him. He hits the Afterburner anyway. He needs about 15 seconds of continuous lock to launch. The terrain keeps handing him 9, and deep in the valleys ahead of him, a second problem has already started. One his radar cannot show him. The surviving missile's navigation fix is sliding. A few yards east, then a few more. 2 clocks are running now, and the pilot only knows about his. 60 miles of Iranian mountains later, his fuel state makes the decision his controller was about to make for him. The Tomcat turns for home with empty tanks and full weapon rails. He did everything right. The airplane simply could not be in 2 places at once, and it needed to be. At 0355, the 3 survivors cross into the interior. The slide in their fix has grown from yards to hundreds of yards. The cause sits under a stand of trees off a provincial highway. A trailer, a mast, 1 dish pointed at the sky. A real GPS signal is astonishingly faint by the time it falls from orbit. Weaker than a millionth of a billionth of a watt. The ground transmitter does not have to fight the satellite. It simply broadcasts a slightly louder counterfeit of the same signal on the same frequency. And a GPS receiver is polite. It believes whoever talks loudest. 2 of the 3 Tomahawks now believe they are further east than they really are. A few hundred yards off, and growing. The third has a ridgeline between it and that dish and never hears the lie. A few hundred yards of error at the aim point puts a warhead in a farmer's field instead of a bridge span. Then the 2 drifted missiles cross a ridge, and their fix snaps back true in a single beat. A quarter of a mile of accumulated error gone, and no satellite had anything to do with it. The instrument that did it is one you have already seen. The same small radar altimeter under the nose. As the missile flies, the altimeter reads the ground beneath it. Rising, falling, rising again. The flight computer compares that rise and fall against a map built from satellite photographs before the mission ever launched, where the shapes match. The missile knows exactly where it is with no satellites, and nothing to jam or counterfeit. Match points sit every few dozen miles along the route. Each one wipes the accumulated error back to 0. That trick has a name: terrain contour matching. It is why Tomahawks were hitting small targets 1,000 miles away in the 1980s, years before GPS existed. And it is why they still hit them when the GPS gets stolen. At 0418, the track file that has been racing these missiles across Iran since 0304 reaches a CVOM Cordad battalion holding a ridge on the approaches. This is the heaviest system that will look at them tonight. A Bashir surveillance radar with 350 kilometers of reach, an X-band engagement array on each launcher vehicle, 3 Tier 2B rounds riding ready above it, active radar homing in the terminal phase. Reaching out past 100 kilometers, the Bashir sweeps through the position box. All 3 targets paint once. Then they are gone. Here is why, and it is the most useful thing in this entire video. The Tier 2B was built for aircraft. Aircraft come at you or run from you, and either way, their speed along your line of sight is large. These Tomahawks are crossing the battery's front rather than flying at it. Their speed toward the radar is close to 0. Every radar of this class runs a filter that erases things that are not moving toward or away from it. Hills, trees, buildings, traffic on the highway. It is the only way to see anything at all. 3 cruise missiles crossing at right angles land inside that filter and get thrown away as ground. The commander holds his launchers on the bearing anyway and watches 3 healthy targets stay buried in the notch. His system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. And the design has a blind spot shaped precisely like tonight, which leaves one thing between 400 miles of Iranian airspace and the bridge, on a hard stand 2.5 miles east of the span. A Tor M1 crew has been closed up and hot for 20 minutes. The warning from Air Defense Command was short. Cruise missiles inbound. Northwest, expect low. At 0431, their search radar catches all 3. 9 miles out, under 300 feet. 90 seconds from the bridge, the commander picks the middle track and calls the launch. The missile leaps vertically out of one of the 8 tubes in the vehicle's roof, the launch charge thumping through the hull. It tips over hard in midair and tears off to the northeast. Here is what separates this from everything else that looked at them tonight. Every other system treated cruise missiles as a sideline. The Tor was built for nothing else, swatting small, low, fast things out of the sky over the one spot it is parked to protect. Search radar on top, engagement radar on the front, 8 ready rounds standing between them, and the 9mm 331 carries no seeker at all. The ground radar tracks the target and the interceptor together, and radio's corrections all the way in. Hard to jam, very quick off the mark. It runs at about Mach 2.5. It reaches out 7.5 miles. Minimum engagement altitude, around 30 feet, which matters, because the targets are lower than most systems are allowed to shoot. The warhead is roughly 32 pounds of fragmentation. It is a radio-controlled shotgun shell. The vehicle does all the thinking, and the shell never has to. 10 seconds of flight. The warhead catches the middle Tomahawk over open ground. A hard, wide flash. 550 miles an hour of cruise missile comes apart mid-stride. Engine and wing cartwheeling into the scrub. Second score to the defense, but the outer 2 streak passed on their own bearings. A fan of fragments rakes the trailing missile's tail as it goes. It holds together. The buffet walks it 200 yards off its planned line. By the time the Tor's engagement mount could swing onto either survivor, both are inside its minimum range, under a mile, too close to shoot. The engagement radar on that turret is a single mount. It points one direction at a time, and it has to fly its own missile onto the target. So the crew is not solving where the target is. It is solving where the target will be when the interceptor arrives. 3 targets, 3 different crossing angles. The mount builds one solution at a time. They took the middle track because it offered the cleanest crossing angle of the 3. Right call. The outer 2 were never reachable. Slewing onto a new bearing and recomputing the lead would have cost seconds those targets no longer had to give. A goalkeeper with 1 glove. He saves the shot he leans toward, and 2 more are already behind him. That was the last layer. And it just did exactly what the people who planned this expected it to do. The planners priced Iran's defenses along that corridor at 2 rounds before the ship ever loaded a cell. 2 intercepts, somewhere along 990 miles, from systems whose positions and limitations are cataloged in a binder somewhere. So they fired 4. Not because 4 warheads are needed to drop a bridge span. One is. They fired 4, so that 2 would still be flying right here, 90 seconds out, with the arithmetic already done. Every loss you have watched for the last 20 minutes was a line in a spreadsheet before it was a fireball. And the last minute of a Tomahawk's flight is the smartest part of it. 2 miles west of the river, both survivors open a small optical window under the belly. The lead missile makes one crisp correction, a nudge onto a new line, as though it just recognized something underneath it. It did, the river bend and the road junction beside it. Look at that small glass window under the missile's belly, just forward of the wing. In the last few miles, the missile stops trusting its map and starts looking. A downward camera behind that window photographs the ground. The computer matches what it sees against reference imagery. The mission planners loaded before launch the river bend, the road junction, the bridge approach. Each clean match tightens its position to within a few feet, several times a second, all the way down. A missile that cannot find a match flies its last best guess on speed and heading alone. Close. And close does not drop bridges. It is the difference between following directions to a house and recognizing the house. The lead missile recognizes the house at 4 miles out and settles onto the span with no room to spare. The trailing missile, still carrying the Tor's 200-yard shove, is seeing the right ground from the wrong angle. It hunts for pictures that refuse to line up. Its first clean match comes barely a mile out, enough time to fix its left-right error, not enough altitude left to stretch the dive forward onto the deck. Each round carries a WDU-36B warhead, 690 pounds, with 265 pounds of PBX-107 packed inside it. The fuse in the lead missile's tail is set to wait to go through the concrete rather than on top of it. At 0435, 108 minutes after the first hatch opened, the lead Tomahawk goes through the deck of the bridge nose first. It holds for a fraction of a second. Then the charge lets go underneath. The trailing missile pitches into the eastern embankment, 300 yards short, opens a crater in the approach, and flattens a signal hut. Here is what that fraction of a second bought. The same warhead going off on top of the deck craters the surface and scars the steel. That is a 2-week repair. Detonating underneath it lifts the deck off its supports and shears the structure at the same instant. A rail bridge like this is a long board laid across brackets. Crater the board and you patch the board. Break a bracket, and the board does not just sag into the gap, it levers the sections that leaned on it off their own supports. That is the difference between an inconvenience and a shutdown. Now here is the part most videos will not tell you. Iranian accounts put 7 impacts on and around that bridge before the night was over. This was one flight of 4, inside a much larger night. There were no casualties reported by anyone, and within hours, Iranian engineering crews were on the riverbank. On another line damaged the same week, Iran's national railway said a track was rebuilt and back in service in under 15 hours. Provincial officials in Golestan insisted freight kept moving. Some of that is repair. Some of it is messaging. From the outside, you cannot fully separate the two, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the thing that got broken at that river is not really made of concrete. That line carries more than 3 million tons a year toward the Turkmen border. 70 kilometers north freight moving between Iran, Kazakhstan, Russia, and China along a corridor. 2 capitals spent a decade building specifically, so it would not depend on anybody's permission. You can pour a new span in a season. So what you cannot pour back is the assumption that the corridor was out of reach. 70 kilometers north. At the border crossing where the gauge changes and the containers get lifted from one country's bogies onto another's, the trains kept arriving on schedule. They just had to be told, one by one, where to stop. If you want to see the other half of this, the systems the US Navy uses when the target shoots back. Watch this one next. Bye for now.